This is a topic that's of great interest to me. It's about the camping trips of Edison, Ford, Burroughs, and Firestone. And in researching this, I learned a lot of new information as well. So at this time, I'm going to start the PowerPoint. In this picture, we have Clara Ford standing in the car, Henry Ford standing up, Mina Edison and Thomas Edison. And where are they? They are in Big Cypress, which lots of times is considered to be the Everglades, but it's actually next to the Everglades. There was talk of it becoming part of it. It is a wet cypress, and I believe the Everglades are more grass, but they're side by side. So basically it's like being in the Everglades. And back in their day, when they go on this trip, it's a very difficult place to get to. Now you could go on 75 and it's exit 80 something to get there. Back then they went to LaBelle and then proceeded and realized that the roads were pretty much terrible or non-existent at that time. How does this all happen? Well, Edison and Ford, and I know you know who both of them are, had developed quite a close friendship in a brief amount of time. They had become reacquainted in 1912 after Ford and Edison had briefly met in a convention in 1896. And Ford had become good friends with the naturalist and writer John Burroughs. I don't know how many of you are familiar with him, but he was very well known then. His writings were very popular. And even today, when I'm looking up schools, there are a number of schools that are called John Burroughs schools. I think there's at least 16 still. So he was well known to people at the time, perhaps not so much now. But he was an older man. He was older than Thomas Edison by 10 years. Henry Ford is 16 years younger than Edison. And then when Harvey Firestone joins them, he is 5 years younger than Ford. Well, they invited John Burroughs to come down, and John Burroughs had become friends with Ford. He had written actually against the automobile, so Ford decided to entice him into liking one by sending him one. And he does get an automobile. He lives in the Catskills of New York. He practices driving and he's not very good at it. And he drove right through his barn. But beyond that, he and Ford had struck up a friendship. He thought he was a great man. So he is going to join them on this visit to the Edisons. And that's when they decide that they'd like to go out to Big Cypress, pretty much for an adventure, enjoy nature, because John Burroughs is definitely into nature. That's what he writes about. So there's their 5 vehicles. Well, they go out into Big Cypress, right near the Everglades, probably about 65 miles or so from Fort Myers to get there, but not like the quick trip down 75 we'd have. And they set up tents and they think they have it all planned out. They're going to have this great trip. And the road to there, in fact, their guides, they hired 3 guides, they encouraged them not to even go because it's crazy. I don't think we can imagine what it was like then, how bad the roads were filled with ruts, how difficult it was for their vehicles to navigate the roads. But eventually they arrived there and things are going pretty well. They're enjoying nature, doing some walks, but a big rainstorm comes. And most of the tents are flooded. One of the tents is safe. So they all crowd in this tent overnight. But what happens, it rains so hard that one side drops down. And the people that weren't already pretty wet, they all became sopping wet. And Clara Ford kind of jokes that she felt it was unfair because she got the river view because it was so wet in there and the rest of them weren't able to experience that. But eventually they all did because they all became sopping wet. And by the way, also during this time, Clara Ford, by the way, is deathly afraid of snakes. And there's a lot of them around. In fact, Henry Ford takes some time when it's not raining to go out and shoot some snakes to take care of that issue for Clara, but realize also that the water is going to bring up a lot of the snakes. Here's another interesting picture of Mr. Ford. The Edisons were birders, and Clara and Henry, they built a whole preserve type area near their home, a birding sanctuary. So I find this picture interesting, and I've read 2 captions for it and did some research, and I'm not an expert on bird identification. Some places it says Henry and the pheasant, and some places it says Henry and the turkey and the wild turkey, but no matter what, Henry Ford did shoot that while they were on this trip. And this is another example of them traveling. Do you like how they're carrying the tire on their way to the camping trip? And there's Clara, Henry Ford, and there's John Burroughs, the naturalist. This is post-trip, so I'll just get you up to date that they stay one more day and night, but it is unseasonably cold for Florida. It's February. It's cold. It's wet. The weather isn't getting better. They can't do anything. And eventually, and the snakes are there. And eventually they decide to return back to Fort Myers. And I read 2 things. One that says Burroughs and Charles didn't want it to end. And then there's another accounting that says Burroughs and Charles and Edison didn't want it to end. But no matter what, they all returned to Fort Myers. It ended after a little over 2 days. This picture I enjoy because it's Charles Edison, Madeline, and her friend who all went on the camping trip, as well as Edsel Ford. When they all returned back to Fort Myers, the Fords end up staying they all stay for a couple of weeks, but Edsel gets to stay for longer. And Madeline writes that she thought it was good for Edsel because he didn't get to be around young people of his own age very often. So they had some great times with him. Now, when we talk about Edison and Ford's camping trips, lots of people don't think they start till 1916. Some people say 1915. The official first camping trip of the Vagabonds, which is what they call themselves, could be 1916. It could be 1915 when they go out to California. I'll tell you that in a minute. But I believe it's 1914 because that's the first time they go camping, and it's the inspiration for other trips. Firestone wasn't down there then, and it's really not recognized more because there were no reporters along. On all these other trips, there's lots of publicity, reporters that are invited, reporters that aren't invited, but this one was a spur-of-the-moment decision, and there were no reporters along, so a lot of people don't know about it. In the Florida Life of Thomas Edison, Michelle Albion writes about this trip, and that's very helpful, and it's in some other books too, but I don't think it gets the credit it deserves. So remember, it started here in Southwest Florida. In 1915, Edison and Ford and Firestone all go out to California because there's the big Pan-Pacific, say that 3 times fast, exhibition in San Francisco, California. It was a big deal. They go out by train and all meet up, and people all want a little piece of Edison. He is a superstar. Everybody knows who he is, and they want time with him. Ford also was pretty well known, and they wanted attention from him, but even more so Edison. People always wanted Edison to make speeches. That's not his thing. Lots of times he would just wave. He didn't want to talk much. Ford was much more willing to be the face that's out there if he can control the press and had hand-selected people, but there would be press and people everywhere, no matter where they go, and stops along the way. And Firestone joins in. I'll just take this opportunity to talk to you that Edison, Ford, and Firestone were all very good friends. Harvey Firestone probably isn't as well known. And at the time, in fact, it seemed like John Burroughs was even known better. But Harvey Firestone is the founder of Firestone Tires. You can see he and Ford have something in common. He is from Akron, Ohio. Ford lives in Michigan. Of course, Edison lives in New Jersey. They do all join up and they do all have a friendship. So there they are at a Western Union exhibit, which is interesting because Edison had worked for Western Union as a telegraph operator at one point. So they do visit the exhibition. And then when that's done, they get to go visit with this man in the middle. That's Edison on the left, Luther Burbank on the right, and Henry Ford. And that was a big deal because he was a well-known scientist. Edison wanted the chance to talk to them. They make their way to his home in Santa Rosa. But along the way, this trip gets, a lot of things are happening as different towns along the way. People are coming out when the train goes by. They want him to stop, to speak with them. That's not what Edison wanted this trip to be about. It does happen, but they do get time. And some people believe that this is the inspiration for Edison's later rubber research when he talks to Luther Burbank, the famous scientist. And Firestone is also along, but he doesn't happen to be in this picture. And by the way, they make their way all the way down to San Diego, where there's another exhibit, a Pan-Pacific exhibit, I guess we wouldn't call that, but San Diego also comes into play here. Now by 1916, Edison, Firestone at the end, and in the middle is John Burroughs, the naturalist. And this is also a book that John Burroughs contributes to, and it's talking about their vacation trips of 1916. This is put together by John Burroughs, a naturalist who embraces nature, a writer. He actually likes to follow in the footsteps of people like Whitman. Not so much Thoreau, but people that are naturalists that people admire at the time period. And this is a lovely book. It's not for sale on the primary market now, but put together by Burroughs. It tells about their camping trips. And it's called, he called those trips in nature's laboratory. That's John Burroughs saying that, where he likes to get out and explore nature. And there's a whole booklet that each man got from the trip. What was disappointing for the gentleman was that Ford wasn't able to make this trip for whatever reason. He doesn't join up. And though a book comes out of it, from what I can read between the lines, there's a lot of disappointment. It wasn't quite what Burroughs wanted. He grumbled about it because he wanted Ford along on the trip. Though they did have some great pictures from that trip as well. Well, Ford's not able to join the group, but here they are on the trip. They're traveling through the Green Mountains. They travel through New York, and there is John Burroughs, Thomas Edison, and that man on the right, Harvey Firestone. I love this picture. Looks like Firestone's grinning ear to ear in 1916, and Edison looks like he's contemplating. There are many pictures that come out of that trip. In fact, if you go visit Edison Ford Winter Estates, that exhibit called Into the Wild, you'll see a lot of the pictures from that John Burroughs contributed to that book in Nature's Classroom. And there's John Burroughs with Harvey Firestone. They don't look like they're having a wild time, but they did enjoy each other's company. Though, as I said before, for Burroughs, it was all about having Ford along, and it was a grave disappointment for him. 1917, World War I is taking place. There are no trips scheduled. But by 1918, John Burroughs after the fact, he is going to put together a book again. Firestone helps with it, and it's called Our Vacation Days of 1918. And who's along on that trip? Well, this time we're going to have everybody. Now we're at war in 1917. There was a lot happening. Edison's working with the Naval Consulting Board. There is no trip. But by 1918, they are on the road again, and they're going to join together, Edison, Ford, Firestone, and Burroughs. In 1918, they're going to visit many stops. They have tents along, they have chauffeurs, they have cooks, and they're going to visit the Great Smoky Mountains of Tennessee. That's where they are in this picture. They are going to visit West Virginia, Virginia, and North Carolina. And Edison always is going to have the seat in the front, the lead car. He's the navigator. He's got a compass. At one point on one of the trips, he gives it to somebody and replaces it with another. And he navigates from the front seat. Firestone says, we don't know where we're going, and I suspect he doesn't either. And Edison always favored those unpaved roads, an adventure, a place that was pretty not explored, not confined, not already had people camping there, just something different. And in our exhibit about their camping trips, we call it Into the Wild. And I would say that Edison was the person after Burroughs who enjoyed that the most. But just remember, Burroughs is a lot older than anybody else in this group, and they're not always easy trips on them. And they certainly are jostled around. So can you see Edison up there in the lead seat? In the back, there's Firestone and Ford, and I'm going to guarantee you that they stopped for a picture. And by the way, though Henry Ford would often arrange for the press to be there, Harvey Firestone is the person that often sets up these trips. What does he do? He allows either Edison or Ford to pick where they go, but he hires the cooks, ranges for all those finer details. He's almost like the secretary of the group, and he does all the errands, the setup. Sometimes he brings in the press, but oftentimes it is Ford that does so as well. So there they are all on these trips, and lots of places, little villages. People come out to greet them, or the press does an interview. This is one of my favorite pictures, and it's in Lead Mine, West Virginia, and it's an old water wheel, an old mill wheel. And there you see Edison standing, and John Burroughs is on the top of it with Henry Ford to the left and Harvey Firestone to the right. And this is a very well-known picture. And by the way, Ford is always interested in water and hydropower and what you can do with it. Where Burroughs might see some water and the beauty of nature and reflecting, because he always liked to look at plants and identify things. But also on these trips, we're going to find out that he's getting older, quite a bit older. Sometimes he can be cantankerous on these trips. He's unhappy, complains about the accommodations, the tent. And by the way, they each had their own tent. They had their names embroidered on it. They each had most of their needs attended to. But at this point in his life, that was a lot for Burroughs. And each year successively is going to be a little harder for them. And he wasn't shy about voicing his objections to some parts of the camping trip. Here's another one of them getting their camp set up. So you can see that they have cooks there. They have chauffeurs. They bring along all kinds of people depending on the year. So now we're in 1919. And they're going to go to New York and Vermont, New Hampshire. Another view of how they carried their tires then. And so you can see the cooking taking place. Henry Ford checking things out. This is one I really like, raspberry picking. This is an upper state, it's in New York. There's Henry Ford and John Burroughs raspberry picking, something I would suspect that you didn't always imagine you'd see somebody like Henry Ford, the great business leader, out there raspberry picking on their trip, though I'm sure it was something that John Burroughs enjoyed, and realized that Henry Ford grew up on a farm, and that's originally where he started from. So this is this is their trip. They're going to go from New York, and then they're going to go to the Green Mountains, through the Green Mountains of Vermont, and they'll end up in New Hampshire. And somebody put in there, one of the places that talked about, one of the books I read about them talked about the White Mountains of Vermont. And those are the Green Mountains, more rolling hills, beautiful. And then when you hit New Hampshire, it's going to be the White Mountains. That's the correct place the White Mountains are located. Oh, they had so much on this trip. They had 50 vehicles. They had a camping car with a gasoline stove, a built-in ice box, a heavy touring car mounted on a truck chassis with compartments for tents, cots, chairs, and lights. But realize they have 50 of them. So they're going out to be with their friends, to get to the simpler life. And now we've got 50 vehicles going up. We've got tents, we've got cots, we've got chairs. So they're going into the wild and they're roughing it. The roads are better, but they're still not perfect. But they are also not completely out there in a pup tent camping their way cross country either. Though I know that John Burroughs still considered it a little uncomfortable. And one of the things he talks about is when they go from New York and they visit a place in Albany where Ford, I believe, had a factory, and they go into Vermont, and then they arrive in New Hampshire. And John Burroughs, I have to speak to anybody that's from New England. John Burroughs talks about the beauty of going through Crawford Notch, of seeing the New Hampshire mountains and how impressive it is. And they end up in the Lakes region, and they're going to plan on camping there near Lake Winnipesaukee. I was going to write that word on there for everybody to see, but it is, I would have to spell check myself, and I'm a New Englander. But they end up in a town near Winnipesaukee, but they end up much later than they thought because something breaks down. One of the vehicles break down, and they're not going to be able to camp that night. So something happens differently. They end up here, though it says the Tilton Inn. At the time, it was called the Choice Hotel. And it is in the town of Tilton, which is right near Lake Winnipesaukee, which is the biggest lake in New Hampshire. And so they decide to book a room there, something they didn't normally try not to do. I mean, they are going into the wild, they are camping. They're not going to be staying in hotels, but they did this time. So they do book a room, and after dinner, they go. This is an unusual story because I like what it tells about Edison here. So they go out to get some fresh air on the porch. And pretty soon the whole town shows up and people are asking for a speech. And members of the Salvation Army, the local Salvation Army, saw their opportunity to raise some money. So they took their tambourines, and they're using the tambourines to and join the crowd. And people are calling for them to talk. But the Salvation Army there, if you put your tambourine out, you can collect money in it. But anyways, Burroughs get up and says a few words. Then Ford got up and spoke. Now, Edison is not one to give a speech, but he does something else that really surprises people. This is not typical of him. He got up off the porch. He took the tambourine. He begins to pass it around. For the Salvation Army. It's hard to refuse Thomas Edison. And soon the tambourine overflowed. And then Thomas Edison borrows somebody's hat to finish the job. And that's the only time I've ever read a story of Edison doing something like that. And the New England Historical Society is the one that tells that. Now today in Tilton, and I'm going to look it up the next time when it's a non-COVID year and I can go back to New Hampshire, the inn is still open, and they do say it's been rebuilt because there's been a couple of fires there, and they do say there's a haunting. It's not by Edison and Ford, but by the way, they do have rooms named after Edison and Ford there, and I'd love to go see it someday. It's right on the main drag in Tilton. The following year, they're going to go to New York, to the area where John Burroughs lives, because he just said he could not camp anymore. He was at an age where he wanted his comforts. And so they're going to go up into New York, in an area where there's a nice place, an inn for them to stay, and they can visit with Burroughs. So that's Henry Ford, Thomas Edison. John Burroughs is in his 80s there, about 84, I believe. So Edison would be about 74. John Burroughs, Henry Ford, Thomas Edison, John Burroughs, and Harvey Firestone. So they're going to visit in Yama, New York, and they're going to stay in the inn, and they're going to try to do a few things out into nature. Ford had arranged for some reporters there. John Burroughs isn't really up to doing much, but they do go out into the woods, and they do have one wood cutting contest. And they give John Burroughs a skinny birch tree, and a Henry Ford, who's quite a number of 26 years younger than John Burroughs. So he's about 58, a big old oak. And guess what? John Burroughs won that because he was chopping down that skinny birch, but it was something to grab the interest of the reporters and people that were there. And on this camping trip, by the way, their wives join in, and so they're staying there too. This is the first time, it's not a camping trip, but on this trip, it's the first time that any women had joined them on the trip since the one in 1914. And they do this trip differently because they know their friend can't do this anymore. And perhaps they even think that this will be the last year of their friend's life. So they go, the last night, they go to John Burroughs' home, Riverby, and nearby is Slabsides, his little cottage that he had built, where he did some of his writing and just his place to get away by himself. John Burroughs was never a wealthy man. So while he was not a big fan of the press and ever joining them on the trips, he also realized the value of having them along because it did help sell some of his books and draw attraction to him. And by the way, I have to tell my joke about Edison, Ford, Firestone, and Burroughs. This is a joke that there's no proof to, but it's written in many different forms and was told. And what it is that they have a vehicle breakdown and a gentleman comes upon them and he is chatting with them, and Henry Ford introduces himself as Henry Ford, the founder of Ford Motor Company and the Model T, and Edison is introduced as the famous inventor who invented the first light bulb, first practical light bulb, Harvey Firestone of Firestone tires. And the gentleman that had stopped and says, "And who is that man in the white beard? I suppose you're going to tell me he's Santa Claus." So that was one of the jokes that went around about the vagabonds, and they weren't above telling those kind of jokes. In fact, Edison was noted as the great joke teller with the great delivery. Ford would write them out, but he knew his delivery never matched Edison's. And by the way, they are right. John Burroughs is in poor health. He ends up going to California that year for the weather. New York was pretty harsh. And in March, he's coming back by train to return to New York. And he dies just a little ways before he gets home. And so that will be the end of the vagabonds as a group. There are no longer 4 vagabonds, there are 3. Well, the next year, 1921, they are going to be joined by a president. And they're right outside of Hagerstown, Maryland. Here's Henry Ford with his son Edsel. Now look at this, not only, they had a player piano delivered. This is not a simple camping trip anymore. Their spouses join them. Oftentimes, by the way, I didn't mention that other people would join along the way, different people that either Edison or Ford knew, or once in a while, Firestone. Their children might join up. Edsel Ford joined up at other times. A lot of the Firestone sons would join in. But Mrs. Ford, Mrs. Edison, and Mrs. Firestone are along for this trip. And for most of the time, they're going to stay in this area just outside of Hagerstown, Maryland, which is called Camp Harding today. And let me just give you a little information about Harding. And by the way, this is them in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and there's Harding there. They're in Maryland. And Edison was never intimidated by famous people. He would read his paper no matter what. And you can see him in the picture there reading his paper. But they're in Maryland there, and they have a lot more creature comforts. And by the way, people will still come out if they find them and visit them. The Ford oftentimes now is going to try to have the press come when he wants them there and not have them show up unexpectedly. But they did seek out publicity a good chunk of the time because it helps them to sell their products. So what happens with Warren G. Harding? Well, he is elected president of the United States. He had been a senator, and he is invited. Well, Edison was hoping to have some great discussions with him about some power things, electric power in Muscle Shoals, Alabama, but that's not going to happen. And he's looking forward to Harding coming, and they're going to spend a lot of time together. And Edison, Ford, and Firestone, Edison, Ford, and Harding can have these great talks. But what actually happens is that Harding shows up, and he's only going to be able to stay for exactly 27 hours. And of course, ahead of time, you have to have the Secret Service come and check things out. And how this comes about is a man named Bishop Anderson, who was a friend of Harding's and also happened to be a friend of Firestone's, arranges for this to all happen. And he is a Methodist bishop, apparently one given to long speeches and prayers as well. And they do invite Harding along. He does show up. And Harvey Firestone has even shipped some horses down there so that Harding can go horseback riding, because apparently he liked that. Harvey is a good horseback rider. Some of the reading I've done said that the president's seat in the saddle wasn't perhaps that great. There's a lot of other things to be noted about President Harding. The reason some people believe that he was elected president was because, well, he looked pretty presidential. He had white hair. He just conducted himself in the manner of a president. He does not always conduct himself really that way in his private life. He had a relationship with a woman. He wasn't above having that take place in a closet in the White House. He would meet up with her sometimes. He also had a child out of wedlock. He is a very interesting man. Here they are in Maryland on this trip, and you'll see Bishop Anderson on the far left. There's Warren G. Harding with the bow tie in the back. I think you can recognize Mina, Thomas Edison, then there's Clara Ford, Warren G. Harding, and over to the right, there's Ford. Edsel Ford's in this picture. All of their spouses are in this picture as well. And there's President Harding. And this was a big table with a lazy Susan that could be rotated around so people could grab what they want. And they're served this meal in this tent, and up to 20 people could be seated there. Firestone is eventually going to ship his horses back, but they acquire some other ones so they can try some more horseback riding. They sit around and talk. They smoke cigars. Firestone is there arranging anything, any need they have. The press shows up at one point. But Bishop Anderson the next morning, and Harding goes and takes a nap, by the way, too. He has his own tent. He's going to nap that afternoon. and wake up refreshed, and Edison's going to nap, and he will nap anywhere at any time. In fact, he takes a nap, and the President of the United States, Harding, at one point puts the newspaper over him to protect him from bugs or whatever else is out there. But they both end up taking a nap, and then they sit up and talk around the campfire. I think that Edison was a little disappointed by what happened on this camping trip with Harding. He hoped it would be much more, but it didn't end up to be that. But the next day, they have a church service, and Bishop Anderson does a very lengthy talk and prayer, and I think Edison just goes away from the crowd and takes a nap. And by the way, Mrs. Harding was supposed to show up on this trip. She never does. And Harding heads back to the White House, and they camp for a few more days. But they stay mostly there. They do move on to West Virginia, but it's not the trips like where they go from place to place anymore. I also want to mention that while they're on the road, they are also not without controversy. At one point, Henry Ford does share he had bought the Dearborn Independent, a newspaper. He does share his views on Jews. He is an anti-Semitic person. It's a grave disappointment, said John Burroughs. He greatly admires Ford, but he does not agree with his views. Edison, unfortunately, doesn't always seem to challenge him on that. And Harvey Firestone, we really don't know what he thinks, but I do want it to be noted that that was happening during this time period. Eventually, Ford will stop doing that, but whether his views actually, saying things in his newspaper, whether his views truly changed, I cannot tell you, but it was a very non-desirable and, in my opinion, an unacceptable side of Henry Ford. Wanted to show you one of the views of one of the campers that they took on their trip. This is a 1922 vehicle that is outfitted, and this picture, and this belongs to the Henry Ford, but it would have been something they took along on their camping trips. So that was 1921. What happens next? The Upper Peninsula in 1923. So in 1917 and 1922, they don't have camping trips. I want to back up a little bit because that camping trip starts out in Milan, Ohio. They get to go to where Thomas Edison, the area he was born in, and people come out to see him in droves. And then something happens. The President of the United States, Warren G. Harding, passes away from a heart attack. Oh, I think he'd been president 2.5 years, 2 years, 7 months. Calvin Coolidge is going to take over for him. But it is expected that these men, by virtue of their camping trip, even though it was only 27 hours, people are asking them to comment about what happened. They actually start this trip, by the way, in Pittsburgh, make their way to Ohio. So they stop, they pay their respects in Marion, Ohio to Mrs. Harding. Their wives do not join them on that, but afterwards they sit on the porch and they talk to the press, and then they all attend the president's service, his funeral. And then they will go to Dearborn, Michigan, and then they end up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And they do that because it's an area that's a little more, they are able to have some more isolation. Ford has taken his yacht up there. They can spend part of their time there. Edison comes down with a cold during this camping trip, and they're trying to keep that from the press. At one point, they were asking about him, but they are distracted by Ford talking to the press. Usually Ford will defer to Edison as being the most popular person on there, and will defer to his needs. He is also becoming a very well-known person, and he really does think the world of Thomas Edison. And at this point, he takes the lead on things. So it kind of would go back and forth between where they would end up and what they would do between Ford and Edison. This was clearly a trip that Ford wanted to take, but he also wanted to do it for the comfort of Edison. And as I said, Firestone always just went along with what the other people wanted on the trip. I will tell you, the 1921 trip, Mrs. Edison did not enjoy it all. And another thing I should mention is that Mrs. Edison was not a big fan of Henry Ford. She didn't think that she thinks he used her husband for publicity. She liked Clara Ford just fine. How she felt about Firestone, I really don't know, but I know that his daughter Madeline at one point thought that Firestone kind of took advantage of her father or used him for publicity, but I don't think that there's really any evidence of that. So as these things go, people have personalities, and that's how Mrs. Edison felt. And believe me, that Henry Ford tried to do anything that she wanted to make a trip comfortable for her or anything she needed. And she was hoping they'd have a different vehicle. It would have more like the Cadillac would be a little different, more like a separation area when they were traveling up to Michigan between them and the chauffeur. Like Clara's did. So certainly he tried to do that. I like this picture. I think it's interesting. Edison absolutely did not like cigarettes because he felt like the paper was dangerous. It had toxins in it, not the tobacco. So he absolutely hated cigarettes, but he would chew tobacco and he would smoke a cigar. Henry Ford, who's dressed up here like a cowboy, I think this was his idea of a joke. I'm guessing that that cigarette wasn't lit, but he absolutely hated cigarette smoking and did none of those things. And the gentleman with them in this picture is Kingsford, and Kingsford was married to Henry Ford's cousin, and he actually names Kingsford charcoal, which is used. Was developed from leftover pieces of wood and put in a briquette shape. He names it after Kingsford, and he did some business interest for Ford in the lumber area up there in upper New York, and he is also dressed like a cowboy. And you can see that Edison is greatly amused by all of this. But Edison does become ill for a while and has a cold, and they are concerned about him on this trip, but he does recover and it all ends up okay. And we're getting to near the end of their time camping. And this is one more picture. It's not a very good one of Edison and Ford, but remember, people have to sit closely to Edison because he's very hard of hearing. And they go on to they're on this trip, they go into a little town. And this is clearly not like Clara, but they come across these young ladies from a camp called Camp Chautauqua. And they're in this little town, and they are in overall type shorts, and they're just cut above their knees. And Clara Ford was never a person that expressed her opinions about such things. In fact, she was a very patient woman dealing with her husband. And they actually, even though he too had a paramour in his life that wasn't his wife, they were very close. He called her his believer. She clearly knew about this person, but she tolerated a lot, and she was always the type that was a good sport to go along with things. You don't hear her complaining about anything until this trip. And when she sees those young ladies in their shorts, she was really mad because the campers, they ask Henry Ford to sign autographs, and he's happy to do that. But Clara rebukes the young women, refuses to sign because they were showing their dimpled knees. She is very upset about this. I don't know if there was something else going on underneath the surface that made her do this. This is not typical. It's very unusual for Clara Ford. And she rebukes them, and it does make the papers. And as I said, in my opinion, from what I've read, this is not typical Clara Ford. And it does make the papers, and it doesn't sound like Clara Ford, but she did it. And the the camp director kind of says, we don't think there's anything wrong with the way these young ladies are dressed. The other note I have up there is Jep Bisbee. Well, and when they're on this trip, they go by, Henry Ford shows up at this gentleman's house. I think he is actually like a grocery store clerk, but he also plays a fiddle, makes his own fiddles. And Henry Ford goes knocking on his door with it, and says he's Jep home. He wants to hear, he's heard about this fiddler. And he ends up buying his fiddle. And eventually Edison will come in Firestone, and they hear him play. And he says, hey, I want to do a lot more for you. I'm going to send you a Model T. And Edison comes in and says, I'm going to have you, we're going to record you. I'm going to have you make a record, because, you know, Edison has a phonograph company and a record label. And this is all going to happen. But what he does is pay $50 for the fiddle, because Jep does make fiddles that he plays. And he takes that, and it's a long time. Months go by, and it doesn't seem like this is going to go anywhere, because Jep had his moment of fame, and there were reporters, and everybody shows up. But you know what? Ford actually arranges for Jep to get a new Model T delivered, and then they arrange for him to show up in West Orange, and they record him. And he does have some success with the record, and he has his moment in fame because Ford knocked on his door of this very humble gentleman, and he lives till the early 1930s. And by the way, we're talking about Edison's phonograph company. You know, Harvey Firestone encouraged Edison to get into the radio business as well, because he saw that that was going to be something very popular. And that was something that Edison was not interested in doing. And maybe that, in fact, came up on one of their camping trips as well. Those camping trips, there were parts that we got to see, and there were a lot of things that we don't know what happened as well. And we only have one more year left of camping. It's 1924, and by now Edison is getting to be near the age. He's going to die and pass away in 1931, so he's in his late 70s. And Henry Ford decides that that's going to be a lot. He knows that they really don't want to go on a regular camping trip again. But Henry Ford had purchased a place called the Wayside Inn in Sudbury, Massachusetts. And it was an inn, by the way, I'll talk about it more, but where Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, I cannot say that 3 times fast, had stayed. And so they're going to take a trip from there. They can stay there, and they're going to stay in places along the way. And from there, they go visit the summer White House of Calvin Coolidge in Plymouth, Vermont. Now, I am told that this place, this could be wrong, but one of the things I read was it's pretty rustic, and it really didn't even have electricity at that time. I'm not sure if that's true, but it was definitely a very casual place, and it was still a time when presidents would leave DC and go to their summer homes. And this is in Ludlow, Vermont. It was his family home for many years, going way back into the 1700s. And they desperately want to meet up with Calvin Coolidge. And there's a lot of copies of this picture where I'm believing that the photographer most likely labeled it. So you can see there's Firestone, there's President Coolidge, and I'll talk about what he has in his hands, Henry Ford, and then there's Russell Firestone, his son, Thomas Edison, Mrs. Coolidge, and Colonel John Coolidge, who is the father of Calvin Coolidge. And this is a sap bucket that he is presenting to Henry Ford to put into the Wayside Inn. And Ford is delighted. It's a maple syrup. That's a big thing that they do in Vermont, New Hampshire. And it was used by his great-great-grandfather. He presents it to Henry Ford because Henry Ford has made this more than just an inn. He's bought up other things, kind of making it into a historic area. and he has historic artifacts on display. And they all end up signing it. All the vagabonds end up signing it as well. What's not known here is that President Coolidge, who assumed office, and he was known as Silent Cal, they had lost their son, he and Mrs. Coolidge, 7 weeks earlier, their only child, their son, John. He had been playing tennis and got a blister on his foot, and that became infected. It turned septic, and he had passed away. This is only 7 weeks later. So you can imagine that they probably weren't too into like hanging around people. So what they actually end up doing is staying for about an hour. They get a tour of a cheese factory with the Coolidges as well. But that is the extent of their visit. The press does ask Edison, do you think that Calvin Coolidge will get reelected, because he had assumed the office because of the death of Harding? And he said, he makes a joke because he said, yes, if he doesn't talk too much. Calvin Coolidge was known as Silent Cal, and he never did talk very much. And so that was Edison's sense of humor. So they are going to go, this is a picture of the Wayside Inn. I should have put it there first, but that's where they're going to end up back again. But before that, they go through Vermont to Woodstock, which is a lovely area. And then they go to Concord, New Hampshire. And as I'm from New Hampshire, I always have to mention that they go to Concord, they go to the Eco Hotel and stay there. And then they end up, and actually Ford takes his yacht to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and they end up in Portsmouth, which is not very far where I'm from. And they spend a little bit of time there, and then they go their separate ways. And this will be the last trip of the Vagabonds. But the other thing, and then they end up, Ford goes back to Sudbury, Massachusetts, to the Wayside Inn. And that is owned by the Ford family until it's turned over to a trust in the 1950s. So it still operates as a nonprofit. He actually even ran a school, a wayside school for young men for a time. He supported that. But it's still a place that you can go visit. Their main dining room isn't open, but they do have dining. They have rooms, and it sounds to me like it'd be a fascinating place to visit. And I looked on their website, and they still actually have that sap bucket. And periodically they will display it. Of course, things have changed with COVID, but it might be a place you want to check out when times are better. And so that is the end of the trip of the Vagabonds. What happens? Firestone tries again, I believe, and then following year and the year after that, but Edison just doesn't feel like his health is up to it. Now, did they meet up again? Absolutely. They meet up in small groups, they visit with each other, but they never get all together going on road trips together. And it's frequently attributed that they stopped because the publicity came so great. Yes and no, because they sought out publicity, but they sought it out when they wanted it. But I will say that wherever they were, whatever town they were in, if people knew they were coming, they would also show up. So they didn't always have the chance to have the quiet of the earlier trips as well. But it was the end of that time. And I think even though some of it was staged for the press and some of it wasn't, the more information we get, and new information always comes to light, the more we're going to find out about their trips. I need to wrap this up because I've been talking for almost an hour. This is the camper that we have, Henry Ford's Chuck Wagon. According to our registrar, Matt Andres, it was used in 1919 and 1921 camping trips. And that is in our exhibit about their camping trips called Into the Wild. And I threw this joke in here at the end, and they came across a gentleman. I'm going to paraphrase this with a Model T. Ford likes to tell this joke for the rest of his life. He tells this joke, and it says, this guy broke down. He pulls out his tools, his spare parts, and he repairs the car. Henry Ford does. And he says, without identifying himself, Henry Ford pulls out his tools and says, farmer asks, what's the charge? Ford says, nothing. The farmer insisted on paying. This is on one of his vagabond trips and offered $1.50. Ford refuses. He says, I have all the money he wants. And he looks at him and says, hell, you can't have that much money if you drive a Ford. And Ford loved telling this joke. Just want to mention that this is our exhibit, Into the Wild. Come and visit us. There is a great room with pictures in the style of John Burroughs. There are excerpts from his 1916 book. These are some of my sources. There is a book called The Vagabonds. We sell it in our store. The Florida Life of Thomas Edison, a privately published book, There to Breathe the Beauty, some newspapers, articles, the Henry Ford, big time. There's lots of things. I'm going to stop my share here, and I am going to wrap up this visit of the Vagabonds Into the Wild. And I just quickly, I'm going to see if I can show this. We have a movie called Into the Wild that was sponsored by us. It's you can buy it. It's about 26 minutes if you want to know more. We also have this book, The Vagabonds. And by the way, I'm pictured on a camping trip. This is kind of going in and out of the picture, but you can call or come to our store and buy that. If you're a member, you get 10% off. Next month on April 13th, I'll be speaking about Buckingham Airfield and the training they did here during World War II. Mina Edison is involved. I hope you'll join us. The last thing I want to say is I appreciate your support. And during time of pandemic, we're going to continue these every month. And if you ever feel so inclined to make a donation, no obligation, but it's appreciated. Edison Ford Winter Estates, 2350 McGregor Boulevard, Fort Myers, Florida, 33901. Are there any questions? I'm going to check. There are no questions right now. So I just want to say thank you. Hope you'll join us next month on April 13th at 10:30. They're going to be every month. If you have suggestions for topics, my name is Holly, even though it comes up as Mike Cosden. H. Schaefer at EdisonFord.org, or if you have questions you want to ask me. And just remember this, one last thing, those road trips, Edison and Ford, people do them now. It all started with the Vagabonds. Thank you so much, and thank you for joining me, and I'll see you next month. Oh, wait, I think I have a question. Nope. Thank you for the comments. Interesting, thank you. They did a good job. Thank you, I appreciate it. I appreciate all of you, and thank you, and join me and tell other people. Thank you.